You can't do this. This is a residential area. The dust, the noise, it's unacceptable. I am the president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, and I demand you cease these agricultural activities at once." The voice was a grating symphony of entitlement, a sound that could curdle milk at 20 paces. It sliced through the calm morning air, a sonic violation of the peace I had cultivated for the last 3 years. I was 100 yards away, standing on the porch of the old farmhouse, a mug of black coffee warming my hands. From my vantage point, the scene was almost theatrical. A plus-sized woman, stuffed into a violently pink polo shirt and beige capri pants that were losing a desperate battle with her thighs, stood with her hands on her hips, her body forming a perfect, indignant teapot. She was yelling at my foreman, Mr. Martinez, a man whose family had worked this land since my grandfather's time. He stood impassively, his weathered face a mask of polite confusion, holding a wrench as if it were a scepter he was unsure how to wield against this particular dragon. Her car, a late-model white SUV that was already too clean for a country road, was parked haphazardly on the edge of my property, its tires just barely touching the gravel of my access lane. She had apparently driven right past the rather large, professionally carved sign that read, "Sterling Farms, private property, no trespassing." Trespassing was the least of her sins at the moment. Her primary offense was disturbing the peace. My peace. I had retired from the Army Corps of Engineers as a colonel after 30 years of service. My career had been a long, complex campaign of logistics, construction, and managing colossal, often nonsensical, bureaucratic systems. I had built airfields in deserts, reinforced bridges under fire, and negotiated with warlords over water rights. I had learned, in the crucible of 1,000 frustrating engagements, that the world ran on two things: clearly defined lines on a map and the will to enforce them. My retirement plan was simple: return to the farm my great-grandfather had established, cultivate the land, and enjoy the profound quiet that comes from being surrounded by your own property. For 2.5 years, the plan had worked flawlessly. The farm was my sanctuary: 160 acres of rolling fields, old-growth timber, and a spring-fed creek that was the lifeblood of the local ecosystem. It was a self-contained kingdom. Then, they built Whispering Pines Estates. It rose up on the adjacent parcel like a fungal infection, a sprawling grid of identical beige houses with surgically precise lawns and a vaguely fascistic logo on the stucco wall at its entrance. It was a monument to enforced mediocrity, and its border was now my problem. I watched the woman in pink jab a finger toward the tractor. Mr. Martinez's son was expertly maneuvering in the far field, the diesel engine a low, familiar rumble. It was planting season, on a farm. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her complaint was breathtaking. She was standing on agricultural land, complaining about agriculture. It was like buying a house next to an airport and complaining about the noise of airplanes. Mr. Martinez said something I couldn't hear, likely a calm, reasonable explanation that would be utterly wasted. The woman's voice escalated, the pitch rising into a shriek that sent a flock of crows scattering from the old oak tree. I sighed. The morning's tranquility was officially shattered. The campaign had begun before I even had my second cup of coffee. I took a long, slow sip, letting the bitter heat fortify me. I didn't move from the porch. A commander does not rush to the front line at the first sign of a skirmish. A commander observes, gathers intelligence, and chooses his own ground for the engagement. The woman finally spun on her heel, her face a mask of crimson fury, and stomped back to her sterile white SUV, spitting one last threat over her shoulder before slamming the door and peeling away, kicking up a cloud of the very dust she found so offensive. I finished my coffee. The first shot had been fired, a reconnaissance probe, annoying but insignificant in the grand scheme. I made a mental note of her vehicle, her appearance, and the substance of her ridiculous demands. Information was ammunition, and you never knew when you might need it. An hour later, I was in a different uniform. The worn jeans and flannel of the farm had been replaced by the crisp slacks and button-down of my semi-retirement gig. I owned a small, specialized engineering consultancy in the nearby town. We handled complex zoning, land use, and water rights projects, the kind of tedious, detail-oriented work that most firms avoided, but that I found strangely soothing. It was a civilian application of my military skill set, reading maps, understanding regulations, and imposing order on chaos. My office was my new command post, a quiet, orderly space lined with topographical surveys and binders full of county codes. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Clara, buzzed me on the intercom. "Mr. Sterling, your 10 o'clock is here. A Karen Miller for the office manager position." I pressed the button. "Send her in, please." I stood as the door opened, a reflexive habit of military courtesy. A woman entered, smoothing down the front of an aggressive blue blazer that did little to conceal the pink polo shirt I had seen just an hour earlier. It was her, the teapot, the shrieking harpy from my fence line. Karen Miller. She had a resume binder clutched in her hand like a weapon and a smile plastered on her face that was as fake as the Whispering Pines in her subdivision's name. She didn't recognize me at all. To her, I was just some man in a suit, a potential employer. To me, she was the enemy, willingly walking into my primary kill box without a shred of situational awareness. A slow, dangerous calm settled over me. The kind of calm that precedes a meticulously planned demolition. This was no longer a minor skirmish. This was an intelligence opportunity of the highest order. "Mr. Sterling, a pleasure to meet you," she said, her voice now a syrupy, ingratiating purr. It was a stunning transformation. She extended a hand, and I shook it briefly. Her grip was surprisingly firm, the grip of someone used to squeezing the life out of things, like joy or the last dollar of HOA dues from a struggling family. "Please, have a seat, Mrs. Miller," I said, gesturing to the chair opposite my desk. My mind was racing, recalibrating the entire strategic situation. The universe had just handed me my opponent's complete personnel file on a silver platter. The interview was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I went through the motions, asking her about her previous experience, her qualifications, her management style. Her resume was a masterpiece of inflated titles and vague accomplishments. Community Relations Coordinator at a previous HOA. Compliance Oversight Manager at another. She spoke in a stream of corporate buzzwords and bureaucratic jargon that meant absolutely nothing. She used words like synergy, streamlining, and proactive enforcement. I realized with a growing sense of clinical horror that her entire professional life consisted of being a professional bully. She was a petty tyrant for hire. Her address, listed right at the top of the resume, confirmed it. 112 Snapdragon Lane, Whispering Pines Estates. President of the HOA. She had even listed it as a volunteer leadership position, as if it were something to be proud of. She spoke of her role with a kind of messianic fervor, describing her efforts to maintain community standards and protect property values. She painted a picture of herself as a noble warrior holding back the tide of aesthetic chaos. unapproved mailbox colors, rogue garden gnomes, grass that dared to grow a millimeter too high. It's all about consistency, she explained, leaning forward with a conspiratorial air. When people know the rules and see they are enforced without exception, they feel secure. It creates a harmonious living environment. I nodded slowly, maintaining a neutral expression that was the product of 3 decades of dealing with generals and politicians. Inside, I was cataloging every word. Her definition of harmony was absolute, unquestioning obedience. She saw people not as neighbors, but as potential violations. I asked her how she handled conflict resolution. "Oh, you have to be firm," she said, her eyes gleaming. "You give them the official written notice. You cite the specific covenant violation. You document everything. If they refuse to comply, you escalate. Fines, liens. It's the only language some people understand." She was giving me her entire playbook. It was magnificent. Towards the end of the interview, I leaned back in my chair. "This is a small firm, Mrs. Miller. We have a very close-knit culture. Our biggest clients are farmers, ranchers, people who've owned their land for generations. How comfortable are you dealing with, let's call them rural personalities?" A flicker of disdain crossed her face before being replaced by the plastic smile. "Oh, I can handle anyone," she said. "But I do believe that progress is important. Sometimes old-fashioned ways need to be updated for the good of the larger community. Some people are just resistant to change." I knew exactly what old-fashioned ways she was referring to. My ways. The ways of planting and harvesting, of living with the land instead of paving over it. She saw my farm not as a legacy, but as a blight, a stubborn refusal to conform to her beige, manicured world. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Miller," I said, standing to signal the end of the interview. "We have a few more candidates to see. We'll be in touch." She left, leaving behind the faint, cloying scent of cheap perfume and a profound sense of righteous indignation in her wake. I sat back down at my desk and looked at her resume. It was my first piece of intelligence, the first page in a new binder. I walked over to the supply cabinet and retrieved a heavy-duty 3-inch D-ring binder. Black, unmarked. I took a label from the printer and typed 2 words on it: Operation Whispering Pines. I peeled the backing off and centered it perfectly on the spine. I 3-hole punched her resume and clipped it inside. The campaign had officially been launched. That evening, I did not go home and brood. I went to work. My first objective was to acquire the enemy's field manual, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Whispering Pines Estates, HOA. A quick search of the county clerk's public records website yielded the full document. I downloaded the 87-page PDF and printed it on my office printer, the heavy churn of the machine sounding like the loading of an artillery piece. Back home, under the warm glow of my reading lamp, I went through it, page by page, with a set of colored highlighters. Yellow for procedural requirements, orange for financial regulations, pink for enforcement mechanisms, red for potential illegalities and contradictions. It was dense, filled with torturous legalese, but it was just another technical manual. I had deciphered far worse. Section by midnight, the pages were a rainbow of my analysis. I found what I was looking for. The section on nuisances was a work of art in its deliberate vagueness, prohibiting any activity that was offensive or caused annoyance to other residents. It was a blank check for a tyrant. However, I also found their procedural rules. All board meetings required 48 hours notice posted publicly. all official notices of violation had to be sent via certified mail. All fines could be appealed in a hearing before the full board. They had built a little bureaucratic kingdom, but they had also given me the keys to its gates. The most critical discovery came from cross-referencing the HOA's plat map with the original county survey maps I had in my study. The developer who built Whispering Pines had been required to create a 20-foot wide drainage and agricultural buffer easement along the entire property line bordering my farm. This easement, a legally binding restriction recorded with the county, expressly prohibited the construction of any permanent structures and guaranteed the unimpeded flow of surface water and agricultural dust. Her entire complaint was legally void. The dust she was screaming about was, by law, allowed to be there. Her position wasn't just weak, it was non-existent. She had no jurisdiction, no authority, and no legal leg to stand on. She was a general with a paper army invading a sovereign nation. The next morning, I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not yet. An attorney is a weapon you deploy when you have overwhelming tactical superiority. First, I needed to solidify my position with a higher authority. I called the county planning and zoning department. I got a board-sounding clerk who transferred me to a senior code enforcement officer, a man named Mr. Henderson. I laid out the situation calmly and precisely. I identified myself, my property, the adjacent subdivision, and the recorded easement number I had found in the county records. I described the HOA president's actions, her demands, and her trespass. I didn't embellish or complain. I just stated the facts, citing the specific county codes she was in violation of. The boredom in Mr. Henderson's voice evaporated. It was replaced by a sharp, professional interest. "Hold on, Colonel," he said. "Let me pull up that plat. Easement number 734-B. Yep, I see it. Agricultural buffer. Clear as day. She did what now?" I repeated the story. There was a moment of silence on the line, then a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he said. "She can't do that. The HOA covenants don't supersede county land use law. That easement is ironclad. We can send her a formal notice of violation from our office if you'd like. It'll explain, in no uncertain terms, that any attempt to obstruct that easement is a county-level offense." "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Henderson," I said. "Could you send me a copy of that notice for my records?" "Absolutely. I'll open a case file. You'll have a PDF in your email this afternoon." When I hung up, I felt 10 feet tall. I now had official government confirmation of my legal position. The foundation of Karen Miller's authority was a fantasy, and I had the paperwork to prove it. I printed Mr. Henderson's email and the attached draft of the violation notice. They went into the binder right behind the covenant analysis. The next phase of the operation was to build a resistance movement. A tyrant's power relies on the belief that her victims are isolated. I needed to show them they were not alone. My first stop was with Mr. Martinez. I found him servicing the tractor, his movements efficient and sure. I told him about the woman, her interview, and my initial findings. He listened patiently, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. When I was finished, he nodded slowly. "She is a problem, Colonel. She yells at my wife if we have a family barbecue. She complained about the sound of my grandchildren laughing in the yard. She told my son his truck was too loud for a residential community." "Does she fine you?" I asked. "She sends letters," he said with a sigh. "Thick, cream-colored envelopes. My son throws them away. We do not live in her kingdom." "Good," I said. "But others do. Do you know anyone inside who's had trouble with her?" He thought for a moment. "The widow, Gable, in the little house by the front gate. A sweet old woman. Karen is trying to force her to get rid of her bird feeders. Says they attract vermin. That woman loves her birds. Mrs. Gable, my first potential insurgent. I found her that afternoon, a tiny, frail woman with kind eyes, tending to a small but immaculate garden. I introduced myself as her neighbor from the farm. Her face lit up when I mentioned the Sterling name. She remembered my grandfather. I didn't mention the HOA at first. We talked about her roses, about the weather, about the changing face of the county. Then, gently, I asked about her bird feeders. Her face clouded over. She produced a stack of letters from a drawer in her kitchen. They were identical to the ones Mr. Martinez described. Heavy cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the vaguely fascistic Whispering Pines logo. They were filled with escalating threats, citing a rule about unnatural attractions for wildlife. The fines had reached over $500. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "My late husband, Arthur, he built that one for me." She pointed to an ornate wooden feeder swarmed by finches. "It's all I have of him." I looked at the letters. I looked at the sweet, terrified woman. The cold anger I had felt in my office began to simmer. This wasn't about rules. This was about cruelty. It was about a bully deriving pleasure from tormenting the powerless. "Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice low and steady, "may I make copies of these? I am putting together a file. I believe Mrs. Miller is acting far beyond her authority. I believe her actions are illegal." A flicker of hope appeared in her eyes. "You think so?" "I know so," I said. "You are not alone in this." She gave me the letters. I took them back to my office and scanned each one. Every page was a testament to Karen Miller's petty sadism. I added them to the binder. Section 3. Witness Statements and Evidence of Harassment. Over the next week, I became a quiet observer of Whispering Pines. I drove through the neighborhood at different times of day. I saw the telltale signs of oppression: a basketball hoop hastily hidden in a garage, a family quickly taking down a small inflatable pool as a white SUV drove by, a man furtively painting his mailbox the approved shade of beige under the cover of dusk. The place was a suburban police state, and Karen Miller was its tin pot dictator. I gathered more allies. The young family, fined because their children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were deemed unapproved graffiti. The bakers, ordered to remove a small vegetable garden from their backyard because it violated the aesthetic uniformity of the community. Each story was the same. Each family felt isolated, overwhelmed by the official-looking letters and the threat of liens on their homes. Each one gratefully gave me copies of their documents, another file folder for my growing opposition research. The binder was now nearly 4 inches thick. It was no longer a file. It was a weapon. It was time to bring in heavy artillery. My first call was to David Chen. We had served together in Iraq. I was a colonel in the Corps of Engineers. He was a major in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I had built the bases, and he had handled the legal frameworks that allowed us to operate them. He was sharp, aggressive, and had a deep, abiding hatred for bullies and bureaucrats. After leaving the Army, he had opened a private practice specializing in property and contract law. He was, in short, the perfect man for the job. I met him at his office, a sleek, modern space that was the polar opposite of my own. I didn't give him a long preamble. I simply placed the binder on his polished conference table. "Operation Whispering Pines," I said. "I need you to build me a legal kill box." David, ever the professional, didn't crack a smile. He opened the binder. For the next hour he was silent, his eyes scanning page after page. He read my analysis of the covenants. He studied the county plat maps and the easement documentation. He reviewed the notice of violation from Mr. Henderson at the zoning department. He meticulously examined the copies of the fine notices sent to Mrs. Gable and the other families. When he finally looked up, there was a predatory gleam in his eyes that I hadn't seen since we were dealing with a corrupt contractor in Fallujah. "John, this isn't a legal case," he said. "This is a damn masterpiece. You've done all my work for me. You have her on jurisdictional overreach, violation of county code, harassment, and selective enforcement. This binder isn't opposition research, it's a conviction." "So what's our first move?" I asked. "We send a letter," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "But not the kind of letter she sends. We're going to send her a formal cease and desist. It will be addressed to her personally, as well as to the HOA Board of Directors. It will cite the specific state statutes and county codes she's violating. It will reference the active case file with code enforcement. It will inform her that any further communication with you or the other residents you've documented is to go through my office. And it will put her on notice that if she continues this course of action, we will not only sue the HOA into oblivion, but we will also file suit against her personally for tortious interference and seek to hold her liable for all legal costs." "Personal liability," I said. "That should get her attention." "It's the legal equivalent of a 500-pound bomb," David confirmed. "We're not just aiming for her little HOA tank. We're vaporizing the entire motor pool. We send it via certified mail, return receipt requested. We give her 10 days to respond in writing, confirming she has ceased all harassment. The strategy here is to let her walk deeper into the trap. A bully like this won't back down. She'll escalate, and when she does, she'll hang herself." He was right. David drafted the letter that afternoon. It was a thing of beauty, 6 pages of dense, threatening legalese that was both terrifying and perfectly, unimpeachably correct. He sent it out the next day. The clock was ticking. 9 days passed in silence. It was an unnerving quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes an ambush. I continued my work, but my focus was on the coming storm. I checked the mail every day. On the 10th day, her response came. It was not a letter from a lawyer. It was not a letter of capitulation. It was a formal notice on the same thick, cream-colored cardstock as all the others. It was addressed to me. It informed me that a special hearing of the Whispering Pines Estates Disciplinary Committee had been called to address my ongoing pattern of agricultural nuisance and non-compliance with community standards. The hearing was in 4 days. The notice also included an invoice for a newly invented community impact fee in the amount of $5,000 for damages caused by dust and noise. She had not only ignored David's letter, she had spit on it. She had walked right into the kill box. I scanned the notice and emailed it to David. His reply was almost instantaneous. "It's better than I hoped. She's just formally invited us to her own execution. Be there. I'll be right behind you." But Karen Miller had one more blunder left in her. 2 days before the hearing, I received a call from Mr. Martinez. He sounded agitated. "Colonel, you better get down to the north fence line. There's a crew here, a landscaping company. They say the HOA president sent them. They're here to build a dirt wall." A berm. She was trying to build a berm on the agricultural easement, a direct physical violation of the county code that Mr. Henderson had specifically warned her against. It was a gift. A beautiful, stupid, wonderfully arrogant gift. I grabbed my phone and the binder and drove my truck down the access road. There they were. A small crew of 3 men with a bobcat and a pile of dirt. They were about to break ground. I parked my truck, blocking their path. I got out, calm and steady. The foreman, a tired-looking man in a sweat-stained shirt, walked over. "Can I help you?" he asked. "You can," I said pleasantly. "You can start by telling me who hired you to do this work." "The HOA lady, Miller." "I see," I said. "And did she provide you with a survey map and a county permit for this construction?" The man looked confused. "Permit? It's just a dirt berm." "It is a dirt berm being constructed on a legally protected county drainage and agricultural easement," I stated, my voice flat and hard. I opened the binder to the plat map, highlighted in yellow. "This land right here. You are currently trespassing on my property to begin illegal construction that violates County Code 117.3. I have an active file open with County Code enforcement on this very issue." I then turned the page to the letter from David's law firm. "This is a letter from my attorney. He's already put the HOA and Mrs. Miller on notice. By proceeding, your company is not only engaging in a criminal act of trespass and property damage, but you are also making yourselves personally and corporately liable for any and all damages and legal fees that result." I let that sink in. The foreman's face went pale. He looked at the official maps, at the lawyer's letterhead, at my dead serious expression. He was a working man, not an idiot. He knew he was being played for a fool. "Let me make a call," he muttered, pulling out his phone. I didn't just wait. I started my own phone's video recorder. I filmed the truck, the bobcat, the pile of dirt, and the bewildered crew. Then, I filmed the foreman arguing on the phone. I couldn't hear the other end, but I could hear him clearly. "I don't care what she told you. The guy's got maps. He's got a lawyer. He's talking about county codes. We're not getting arrested for some crazy HOA lady. Pack it up. We're leaving." They packed it up. They left. I stood there for a long moment, the quiet returning to the fields. I stopped the recording. It was 27 seconds of pure gold, the final nail. Or so I thought. That evening I received another call. It was a man's voice, nervous and quiet. "Is this Colonel Sterling?" "It is." "My name is Arthur Gable. My aunt is Mrs. Gable, the woman with the bird feeders." I immediately recognized the name. The late husband. This must be a nephew. "Yes, Mr. Gable. What can I do for you?" I'm the treasurer of the Whispering Pines HOA," he stammered. "I saw the letter from your lawyer. I saw the notice for the special hearing. Colonel, this has gone too far. Karen is out of control. She's going to bankrupt the association and get us all sued." The inside source. The final piece of the puzzle. "What is it you need to tell me, Arthur?" "She's been paying her brother-in-law's landscaping company. A company called Prestige Scapes. They get a $5,000 a month beautification retainer. They've never done a lick of work. Not once. It's just a slush fund. And she's using HOA money to pay her own personal lawyer to fight your guy. It's all in the financials. I have the records. I can't be a part of this anymore. It's not right. What she did to my aunt." "Can you get me those records, Arthur?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "I can email them to you," he said, his voice filled with a mix of terror and relief. "Please, just stop her." "I will," I promised. "You have my word." An hour later, the files were in my inbox. Bank statements, invoices from Prestige Scapes, checks signed by Karen Miller. It was all there. Embezzlement, fraud, self-dealing. It was the kill shot. I printed every last page and added it to the binder. It was now complete. The case was closed before the trial had even begun. The night of the hearing, the community clubhouse was packed. Word had gotten out. This wasn't just about the farm anymore. This was a revolution. I saw Mrs. Gable in the front row, looking nervous but resolute. The Youngs were there, the Bakers. Dozens of other faces I didn't know, but who all wore the same expression of weary frustration. My insurgency had become an army. David Chen arrived a few minutes after me, looking sharp and confident in a dark suit, carrying a slim briefcase. He gave me a short, firm nod. "Showtime," he murmured. The board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Karen was in the center, flanked by two sycophantic-looking men who nodded at everything she said. Arthur Gable, the treasurer, sat at the far end, looking pale and sick. Karen banged a small, toy-like gavel on the table. The whining electric motor of the ancient projector fan was the only other sound. "This special hearing is now in session," she announced, her voice dripping with self-importance. "The subject is the ongoing nuisance violations of the adjacent property, Sterling Farms, owned by John Sterling." She launched into a prepared speech, a rambling tirade about property values, community standards, and the uncooperative and hostile nature of my farming operations. She presented photos of dust clouds. She played an audio recording of a tractor engine. It was a pathetic, amateurish display. When she was finished, she looked at me with a triumphant smirk. "Mr. Sterling, do you have anything to say in your defense before this committee votes on the levying of the $5,000 community impact fee?" I stood up slowly, the binder in my hands. I placed it on the table in front of me with a solid, definitive thud. "I do," I said, my voice calm and filling the silent room. "First, let's address the jurisdictional issue." I turned to the projector, which one of my allies had set up for me. "If you could please turn on the projector." The first image flashed onto the screen. It was the county plat map, with the 20-foot agricultural easement highlighted in bright red. As you can see, your entire case is based on a false premise. You have no authority over my operations. In fact, the county has guaranteed my right to conduct them. Your demands are not just petty. They are illegal, and the county knows it. The next slide was a high-resolution scan of the notice of violation from Mr. Henderson at the zoning department, addressed to Karen Miller personally. A gasp went through the crowd. "This is a sideshow!" Karen shrieked, her face turning blotchy. "This is about your refusal to be a good neighbor." "On the contrary," I said, my voice cutting through hers. "This is about your refusal to be a lawful one, and it seems to be a pattern." I looked towards Mrs. Gable. "Mrs. Gable, would you mind telling the community about your bird feeders?" Timidly, she stood and, in a soft but clear voice, told her story. She held up the stack of threatening letters. The crowd murmured, angry now. Then Mr. Young stood up and talked about his children's chalk drawings. Mrs. Baker talked about her vegetable garden. One by one, the people Karen had terrorized stood and gave their testimony. Her face went from red to ashen white. "This is irrelevant," she finally shouted, banging the toy gavel. "This hearing is about Mr. Sterling." "This hearing is about you, Mrs. Miller," I said, my voice like ice. "It's about your abuse of power, an abuse of power that escalated 2 days ago." I played the video, the 27 seconds of the landscaping crew, packing up and leaving my property. Her direct, failed attempt to violate county law, for all to see. The room was dead silent. "And now," I said, advancing to the final, most damning slides, "let's talk about how you've been paying for this little vendetta." The first bank statement appeared on the screen. an arrow pointing to the $5,000 monthly payment to Prestige Scapes. The next slide was the corporate filing for Prestige Scapes, listing the owner, Mark Miller, her brother-in-law. The next slide was a check from the HOA account to a law firm, signed by Karen, dated the day after she received David's letter. You have been using this community's money to enrich your family and pay for your personal legal battles, I stated, letting each word land like a hammer blow. That isn't just a violation of the bylaws. It's fraud. It's embezzlement. At the end of the table, Arthur Gable stood up. His voice shook, but he did not waver. It's true, he said. As treasurer, I can attest that these records are accurate. I can no longer be complicit in this. I move for a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of Karen Miller and the entire board, effective immediately, on the grounds of gross financial malfeasance. A man from the back of the room shouted, "I second the motion." Karen was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Her two cronies on the board looked terrified. "All in favor?" Arthur called out. The response was a deafening roar. A forest of hands shot into the air. "Aye." "All opposed?" Silence. Karen and her two board members sat frozen, utterly defeated. "The motion carries?" Arthur said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. "Mrs. Miller, you are removed from your position. Please vacate the chair." For a moment, she just sat there. Then, with a choked sob, she grabbed her purse and fled the room, pushing through the crowd of her former subjects, who parted before her not with respect, but with utter contempt. The reign of the petty tyrant of Whispering Pines was over. In the chaotic aftermath, an interim board was elected on the spot. Arthur Gable was the new president. Their first act was to unanimously vote to rescind every fine Karen had ever issued. Their second was to issue a formal written apology to me and the other residents she had harassed. Their third was to hire an independent auditor and hand over all of Arthur's evidence to the district attorney's office. The legal and financial fallout for Karen was swift and brutal. The HOA, under its new leadership, sued her personally to recover the embezzled funds. The district attorney brought criminal charges for fraud. Faced with ruin, she and her husband sold their house at a loss and disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of bitterness and a neighborhood breathing a collective sigh of relief. A month later, I hosted a barbecue. I opened the gates to Sterling Farms and invited the entire neighborhood of Whispering Pines. They came in droves, not as suspicious outsiders, but as neighbors. They brought their children, who marveled at the tractors and ran laughing through the fields. Arthur Gable presented me with a plaque, a simple, heartfelt thank you from the community. Mrs. Gable gave me a jar of her homemade jam. We stood on my porch, the same porch from which I had watched the first shot of the war, and watched the sun set over the fields, a community reborn. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my study. The binder, Operation Whispering Pines, sat on my desk. Its mission was complete. It was a monument to a battle I never wanted to fight, a detailed record of a victory I had been forced to win. I picked it up, carried it over to the fireplace, and placed it inside. I struck a match and watched as the pages curled, turned black, and vanished into smoke and ash. The evidence, the strategy, the anger, it all went up the chimney and scattered into the cool night air. I stepped out onto the porch. The only sounds were the crickets and the gentle rustle of the wind through the whispering pines. No longer a symbol of oppression, but just the sound of the trees that had stood here long before the houses ever did. The peace I had retired for, the profound, hard-won peace, settled back over the farm. My kingdom. Order had been restored.